Hi everyone, welcome back to Class 101. Bryce Coe here, and today we'll be learning about brush pens. Brush pens are one of my favorite tools to use because they're extremely versatile. So let's get to the lesson. Okay, so obviously for materials, you'll be needing the two brush pens that you have in your kit. This is the Kuretake brush pen that looks a lot like his brother's. It's got a tip that looks like this, and just look for these four symbols here. Next, you have the Pentel brush pen, and this one I have not put in the ink refill yet. So it's got a white tip, and if you haven't put in the ink refill yet, we're going to do it together right now. Just going to take off this end piece here so that this is where we'll plug in the ink refill. And then you'll go to the packet of refills with these cartridges here. Open it up. And take one of them out. Ooh, there's a little bit of a smudge there, so be careful with these. That's never happened before, but you never know. So just take this guy and plug him in like that until you hear that sound. Looks like there might have been a leak in my bag there, so be careful yourself. And just spin that back on. It will take some time for the ink to fill in the pen, so maybe hold it upright and just wait a few minutes for that to happen. Eventually this pen will fill with ink. I'll show you an example of a pen that I have already over here. It will eventually look like this. Okay, I'll be starting with the Kuretake first. And the first thing I want to talk about is something called taper. So kind of goes without saying, but when you use these pens, keep the same kind of more loose grip and relaxed body posture that you've tried hopefully to have for the other pens. It's going to come in handy today because we're going to be drawing lines across the page, and you're going to want to have not too tense of a grip on this thing and tight body posture that your arm gets stuck. You want to have a smooth flow. So as I said, let's get to that first line. We're just going to start from this side and move all the way over here, and we'll just try to keep a steady pressure all the way across first. Okay, so just hopefully letting you guys get the feel of how sensitive the brush can be. If your line didn't end up as smooth as mine, that might be just because you have less experience with knowing how to hold the pen steady, but also loosely enough that you can move across the page. So let's just try that one more time. And you'll notice that I'm holding the pen sideways. That's probably what you should do for these first few steps. Now let's move on to starting with a harder pressure and gradually loosening up that pressure until it's about as light a pressure as you can get it over here. Okay, so this is what I mean by taper, in which the line starts at a thick line weight and goes to a very fine line weight. And the ability to control your line weight to go from that to that is going to come in handy for a lot of things that we'll get into later in this lesson. So let's just practice that one more time. I'm going to try to do an even thicker line weight at the start here. And you can tell that when I put on more pressure, the hair sort of starts to create more of a texture on the paper. That's just because it's not able to grab onto the paper as well when it's using side hairs. Now I'm going to do another line where I use more of the side of the brush as I move across. And you can see with that creates a lot more texture as sort of the parts of the hair that aren't making as much contact with the page kind of just more or less smear every once in a while. Okay, so I think that's probably a good look at how the Kuretake can function. Let's move on to the Pentel and try the same stuff just to get a comparison. Okay, so let's leave some space here because we're going to come back here with some other lines later, and just leave a little bit of room here, maybe an inch or two. And we'll just start by doing the same things we did up here. Just a solid line all the way across. And wow, I mean, I feel like I can feel a big difference. The ability to get an extremely thin line here means that the Pentel is just a lot more sensitive of a pen. It's got like maybe finer hair, and that can be useful if you have a drawing where you want to have a little bit more of a thin line weight. Just up to your preference. Let's go again. Cool. Now we'll try to do a tapered line going from thick to thin. And one more time. This time I'm going to try to put even more pressure. And maybe I'll go a bit more slowly. The speed at which you go can have a really big effect on the line. Generally speaking, a faster flow means a little bit more consistent, just because you're not like randomly stopping. But you know, if you want a thicker line, you got to go slow sometimes. Okay, and then lastly, I'm going to do the side of the brush. And the flow of this pen, in terms of the ink coming out of this guy, I think is a lot heavier than the Kuretake. The refills that come with this guy are just, you know, it's just a container of ink, versus this is like a sponge inside. So that has an effect as well. Sometimes it can be a little bit too heavy, and you might prefer the consistency of this guy, but your mileage will vary. So next, let's do our final exercise, where what I'm going to do is I'm going to go thin line up and thick line down. I'm just going to repeat that over and over. And that's just to get you guys to have a little bit more practice with how it feels to control a thin line weight versus a thick line weight. So going up, try to go thin, and down, thick. Up, thin, down, thick. And this is a tricky thing to pull off. Just being able to control the pressure on this guy requires a lot of patience, and we just want to kind of build up the muscle memory of the feel that it requires to switch between these two things. You can try to go thinner than me. Honestly, I'm trying to go thinner, but it's a little thick. If you want to go thinner, it's helpful to keep the pen in a more vertical orientation. You're isolating more of the hair away from the page. Okay, so that's the Pentel. Let's just do that same exercise with the Kuretake. And now you'll get kind of a more direct comparison to really how these two pens feel. Personally, I just feel like this Kuretake, I feel that the flow is more consistent for me. But the ability to have kind of the fineness of line that I get on the Pentel is also useful sometimes. Okay, so hopefully this gave you some practice to understand how these pens feel when they're actually touching some paper. Next, let's move on to some more practical examples. Okay, so the first example that I want to do might not look like much. It's actually a tree. But the reason why I want to use a tree is because one of the unique things about using a brush pen that has taper is knowing when to use that sort of taper. What I basically mean is that the choice to draw a line that goes thicker to thinner, like when do you decide to do that? And I think one of the most common ways to use it, because a lot of it, to be honest, is very intuitive, but one of the things that I really like to do because it helps show form better is, okay, so let's say that this is roughly a tree trunk here, or a branch, and I want to show another branch coming off of it. Well, from the inside part here, rather than having a very thick line, starting with a thin line here, and then going out to the kind of normal line weight that I want for the rest of the branch. The reason that this line is effective is because it kind of shows that it's connected to this form here. It's almost like this sort of line is almost like an arrow where it's pointing at the sort of origin point that it comes out of. So as I do more, if I want to have a branch coming out of this guy, then having this thin line as the starting point eases these forms in and out of each other. The other thing with why I wanted to show you a tree is because, generally speaking, the thinness or thickness of a line also indicates how prominent a form is. So as we do some of these branches, we're generally going to try to keep a thinner line weight, thinner thickness, and when we go really, really small branches, we'll try to have that line weight be as thin as we possibly can, just because those forms are not ones that we want to emphasize as much as some of the larger branches. Versus once we get down here, if this is connected to the base of the tree, then I want to have that taper like I mentioned, but then the base of the tree can have a much thicker line weight because this is like where the trunk of the tree is coming from. You can also get some of that really fine line for those cross-contoured sort of dashes. And Doesn't look like much, but this is just trying to demonstrate when to use thin versus thick taper. So do a more of a medium line weight off of these other branches as they get thinner and thicker. So I touched on it briefly there, but basically the fact that you can choose the different line weight using this pen makes it super versatile. So sometimes rather than needing to switch around between the different brush pens, if you want a piece with a varying of line weight, you can just stick to using one pen for the entire drawing. It makes it convenient, but also means that you need to have a good control over the pen and ability to get a line thickness that you want on command. Alright, well, I'm going to move on to another example here on the other side of the page. And what we have here is an example where we have a female character who's got a lot of different materials and textures going on. We're going to cover some of those textures more in depth in the next class, but as far as the taper goes, a human figure has just got a lot of clear examples of when you want to practically think about line taper. Okay, so maybe we'll look at it from that front pose. Seems to show the most here. But we just cover up this tree for now. So, I'm going to start with that front plane of her face and start with the eyebrows, as I mentioned before, which can be helpful for indicating that plane. And I'm going to taper off the eyebrows because they, in real life, often are going to be kind of tapering off at the edges there. So that's just matching that line. Very thin lines for the tops of the eyes because they are a visual thing that you see, but they're not a very strong form. You can taper some eyelashes because those are hairs that come to a very fine point. Very, very thin lines to indicate the bottom of the eyelid. So they're not even a shape, they're just almost just a separation of material from skin to eyeball. The nose, this is more of a style thing. This nose, she has a very strong bridge to her nose. So depending on the style you want to go for, if you want softer features, you might choose to use a really thin line weight on the nose, or thicker depending on what you want to emphasize. If you think the nose should be stronger, then drawing it out like so, and like kind of even drawing that underplane of this nose, which is kind of like a box, and this is the underplane of the box with the front plane there. Draw it. Okay, so for hair here, this is also a great use of taper. So always having lines that go thin to thick kind of can help show that the hair, as it kind of becomes less and less clumped together, goes off into single strands. And then they can be kind of like thicker here where they all start at the forehead and then taper off as those forms become more just connected to the overall hair shape there. we don't get her ear here. Another indication of line can be light and shadow. So choosing some thicker lines where here it appears that the hair is like dark because it's not getting any of the light. It's in shadow. Choosing thicker line weight for that is another useful case. And then now for the armor. This armor is a very strong form, so having a stronger line weight makes sense. But then the cross contour being thinner. Looks like there's a very strong kind of slice or like a scratch in the armor there. And then lots of details that you can kind of just get away with dashes to help indicate it. With this material here, because it's got so much shading on it, so much all the crevices of the cloth going up and down, that's where I often will indicate the lighting and shading by using a tapered line. So starting thin and then thick where I'm at the underside of a form. It's almost like I shaded the shadow, but the line can just kind of do that as well. Fixing these eyebrows, I think she actually has got more of a kind of intense look here, so I'm just going to strengthen those. Let's finish the top of her head here. So compared to a lot of the hard forms that we've been drawing, all this flowing hair means that you can have loose lines, and it's just a very kind of loose object that's sitting on top of the head. So as long as some of those lines start to get conformed to that shape, then you can kind of just be a little bit looser. So I'm indicating some shadow here. My rhythm is also something you'll notice. I'm drawing lots of strokes for the hair to just kind of convey that texture. She's got kind of a hump in her hair here, so I'm going to increase the rhythm there. Also want to strengthen her eye. Okay, moving on to her arm. Her arm is a very strong form. So here's one thing that could happen. If we were to have this all be really consistent here, then some of this might get lost because there's a lot of the same material, right? But the intention of saying her arm is in front, that can mean that just because of the prominence of the form of her arm and you wanting that to stand out against the body, like not to kind of blend into each other, choosing a thicker line there is a good choice for making it stand out, just to make that form stronger. So the contour of the arm here. And there's this bend to the arm, and that bend is one of my favorite places for the use of taper, to show that this is the box shape that we normally think of when we think of the upper area of the arm, but that it's connected to the forearm here. And so the connection is this kind of just thin tapering of line to show that those two things connect to each other, as opposed to just abruptly start and stop. And also, as this arm recedes into the background, because it's going back in this direction as opposed to this being closer to us, having the line get thinner as it moves away is another way to show distance. Also, I'm not going to have it compete with too much, because unlike over here where we're going to have her body, back here it's going to be kind of out in the open. So having a thinner line is not as much of a problem that I need to solve just to make the drawing read and be something that you can understand what's happening. Drawing the box of a hand here. Oh, I mean, I kind of goofed that there. I wanted that to be a thin line, but I wanted a thin line mostly so that it would contrast against this arm that's closer to camera, or to us. So something you can do is you can just draw overline to strengthen the form and make it pop a little bit more. Some cylinders on cylinders here. And curved box. Drawing the underside of that sword hilt using a thick line weight to just indicate the shadow, essentially turning into shading there. And thinner line weight, as this kind of needs to feel like it's going further away from us. Okay, let's just wrap up here with the body. So this top here being a box for the chest. And abdomen. Some cross contour details using thinner line weight. And the hip. Some of the details over here to help make this form pop out a little bit more. And I feel like this edge here, to also make this stand out beyond that one, I mean, it's essentially the lighting is it's darker there, so that's why this reads better in this model. But we can do a similar thing with choosing to make this line a little thicker. And to choose to place stronger details at the ends of this form. So having these lines sort of taper from the bottom and get thinner as they go up. It's a way to make our lines do a little bit of that shading work for us. Okay. I think the last thing I want to do with this is just to finish the hair. So having a loose line, saying that this is a combination of cylinders going this way, rotating around. The knots of this braid give us kind of the opportunity to think of these as separate pieces that are basically cylinders connected to each other, but then using line taper here to connect each of those braids so that they're not just these hulking cylinders just like drawn next to each other, but that they're connected using that line quality. And here I'm going to also taper off my lines to show that it's going from a very strong shaped form into kind of a loose end here. This last plane of the hair, it's coming to a point, but that point is not a strong form. It's actually a bunch of hair just ending, right? So indicating that with thin lines that don't really need to come together, just all converging towards the same end here. Okay, and you know, obviously, as usual, could keep drawing and improving this forever, or at least detailing it, but I think we kind of get a gist of the major ideas here. So let's wrap this up and talk about the mission for this class. So the mission is to get some practice with your brush pen and do a drawing that will use some of the same taper. Pay special attention to how you make your lines. Try to make every line that you draw have intention behind it. Like, why am I doing it thick here? Why am I doing it thin there? You might not get it perfect on every single line. You might make a lot of mistakes, as everyone would in the beginning. But starting to say to yourself, this should be thicker because this form is more dominant, or this should be thinner because this is the detail. Just keep that in mind as you draw, and that will be a really great learning experience for you. And that concludes today's lesson. Your mission is to turn in the in-class work that we did together, just to make sure that everyone's getting some good practice on how to draw those tapered lines. Before we go, let's do a quick recap of what we did today. We practiced with brush pens and focused on their unique ability to draw tapered lines. We did some examples on how to use those tapered lines to convey things like 3D form. In the next class, we'll continue working with brush pens, but with a particular emphasis on how to convey texture. Looking forward to seeing you in the next class. See ya!